In this video, Dan Ives of Wedbush Securities highlights the concerns raised by a recent $100 million investment from Taiwan Semiconductor, particularly in light of DeepSeek's advancements that could lead to stricter regulations. Dan also comments on the expected impact of tariffs on Apple, predicting that loopholes will likely lessen their effects on iPhone pricing, enabling the company to maintain its market position.
Taiwan Semi, but that fear is still out there. And it's kind of interesting because we have export restrictions on quite a few countries, but apparently not Singapore.
Yeah, and I was just there on Friday, right? So I could tell you the sense is that these export controls, it's not going to be really constrained to ultimately Singapore. And I think the fear here, and I think you're seeing on the Nvidia sell-off, is that this is going to be a huge ripple effect. It's going to be harder and harder to get those chips. That's something, even though there's the China piece, it could have a much broader impact across the region. I think bark's worse than the bite. I mean, as someone, in Asia for 2 weeks, I think it's when I get the fears, but I don't think this is something that's really going to be as much of a restrictive factor, despite everything we saw today.
Do you think it's DeepSeek concerns that are spurring this next wave, potentially, of regulation? And I guess perhaps just as importantly, has the train already left the station when you look at homegrown chip development in a place like China?
Look, I think DeepSeek, that was a shot across the bow, because I think everyone recognized, okay, they didn't do this in the basement with no chips. And it comes down to if they use next-gen Nvidia chips, what does that mean? And I think, look, the broader fear, especially that you see in the Trump administration, is, okay, we got restricted more and more. So I think what you're starting to see from an investor perspective is, okay, what does this mean for Nvidia? Second derivatives. Is this going to crimp the supply chain? Now, we disagree. I think when it comes to tariffs, we've seen many times, this is one, it's going to have an impact, but I do not believe it's going to have such a pronounced impact. I think it's being factored in here in terms of supply chain. Still 15-to-1 demand to supply, even when it comes to Blackwell.
Well, okay, bark is worse than bite, but still a bark can be pretty bad if it hurts sentiment, right? If it sort of puts a wet blanket on the party, has an impact on valuation. At what point does it start to do that? And do you have to, if you're an AI investor or even Nvidia investor, have to get less bullish?
Yeah, look, I mean, no doubt you're going through a lot of turbulence here. From a sentiment perspective, you're seeing the stuff. Then it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. But what I'll tell you is it comes down to just demand. Do we see any changes in spending? That demand's going to continue to be there. And I think it's when there's only one chip in the world that ultimately could fuel this. I get we're going to go through this, but in my opinion, these are opportunities, not the time to run for the hills. I think when you look at it in terms of tech winners, if you look over the years, it's period like this and these white knuckle periods that you own the winners, you own the Nvidias.
Well, speaking of a company that's been through cycles like this, Apple, right, on the client side with AI versus on the data center side, it's the biggest premium consumer product company on the planet, and boy, could things get more expensive, iPhones get more expensive under these China tariffs. How much of a threat is that for a company that has some different ways to sell phones, has a lot of cash to do some subsidizing of the debt necessary to help consumers do that?
Yeah, I think we believe there's a 90 and 95% chance that ultimately there's loopholes that they're not going to really be impacted in terms of iPhones from the tariffs. I think very similar to what we saw in 2019. Cook, it goes back to 10% politician, 9% CEO. I think they could absorb, if they actually had to, some of these tariffs with no sort of passing that through to consumers. The bigger issue is if this lasts till September, until actual iPhone 17 production, that's where it gets a little more, I think, nerve-wracking. But as of now, we believe that there'll ultimately be loopholes that Apple is not impacted. And that's why you're seeing the stock not really reflecting too much negative, because the investors are kind of reading through that.
Only 10% politician?
Maybe 50. I'd say 10%. Maybe the last few weeks, 20, 25%.